Sometimes we may want to cache a piece of data, not HTML. We may want to work with this data across different actions or controllers. For example, in one of the projects I worked on a while ago, we had the list of roles that were used in quite a few different places. And this list didn't change that often. Perhaps it changed once or twice a year. So one of the developers in the team decided to put these roles in a cache. Now, this is another example of premature optimization, because as far as I know, he didn't do performance profiling before doing this optimization. So he just thought, because we use it in a few different places, it's better to cache it. Now, the end result was unnecessary complexity that ended up being a smell in our code base. And as we wrote more code, it just got worse. Of course, developers like that never accept this and take responsibility for their mistakes. And if you're working with people like that, my advice is to stay away from dogmatic arguments. Now, that aside, if you do your performance profiling and conclude that a piece of data is better to be stored in the cache for a limited period of time, here's how you do it. So in the index action of customers controller, let's imagine we want to cache the list of genres. So the first time someone hits this endpoint, we'll get the genres from the database and then store it in the cache. In all subsequent requests, we'll get the data from the cache. So if memory cache, this class is defined in a different assembly, so you need to add a reference to that. With ReSharper, it's pretty easy. Alt and Enter, reference system.runtime.caching. So if you're not using ReSharper, you need to manually add a reference to this assembly. This class has a static property called default, which is like a dictionary. So we can use an indexer here. So every item we store in the cache, we use a key to access it. Let's call this genres. So if this is null, we should get it from the database. Memory cache.default of genres. And here we use our context, the genres, the toList. Now, otherwise, we get genres from memory cache.default of genres. And note that this returns an object. So you need to cast it to an IEnumerable of genres. Of genre. Now, as I said before, you should avoid magic strings like this genres here. It's better to define a constant string, but I'm not going to go over that again because I'm assuming you're familiar with that. So this is data caching. But once again, from experience, I want to emphasize to use this technique if you really need to, and only after you have done performance profiling. Don't use this approach blindly to improve the performance of your application. Unfortunately, many tutorials tell you that you should use caching for frequently accessed data that don't change often. While on the surface this may sound like a good idea, in my opinion, this is poor advice for two reasons. One is that by blindly storing data in the cache, you will increase memory consumption of your application. Another reason is that it will lead to all kinds of unnecessary complexities, both at the architectural and code level, especially when you're working with Entity Framework. If in an action you're modifying data with Entity Framework and you want to reference some of the objects in the cache, you're going to run into all sorts of issues because those objects are not part of your DB context. So when you save changes, you're either going to get duplicate data in your database or exceptions thrown by Entity Framework. As a workaround, you have to attach those objects to your DB context, but once again, that itself can cause other issues. So to recap, use this approach after you have done your performance profiling, and also limit it to actions that are used for displaying data, not modifying it. Next, I'm going to talk about a common misconception about asynchronous operations.